Police Department and the Bryan Head Marshal's Office. I've been doing that for about 8 years, and before that, I worked corrections for Washington County Sheriff's Office, and I do some other things for the military as well. But for the instruction, or the period of instruction today, I was asked to answer a few questions, and Carissa let me know that essentially you guys were wanting to know a little bit more about the Good Samaritan law, when to call law enforcement, and as it relates to crises experienced by people experiencing a mental health episode or something of that nature, what to expect from law enforcement, what training do law enforcement personnel go through with regard to mental health and interacting with those in the community who may be experiencing crises, and what the reporting laws and resources are that are available to other stakeholders, other community stakeholders, you guys including. So I'm going to start off with explaining what law enforcement, 100% of all law enforcement candidates will go through what is called CIT training, or Crisis Intervention Team Training. And it was first developed in Memphis, and CIT provides law enforcement-based crisis intervention training for assisting individuals with mental illness and those people who are experiencing those mental health crises. And it is designed to improve the safety of the law enforcement officer as well as the consumer. And for the intents and purposes of CIT, the consumer is the individual who has the mental health disorder or is experiencing that mental health crisis, and family members and other community citizens throughout the community. And CIT is designed to reduce the stigma and the involvement with the criminal justice system. So it is designed to help law enforcement officers understand that mental health issues are real, the individuals who are experiencing them have real needs, and they need to be empathetic to those needs. And I'll explain a little bit what the hierarchy of priorities is for officers as they arrive to a scene, if they have to respond to a mental health call. But CIT was designed to help the officer improve safety of not only themselves, but also the other individuals involved in a mental health crisis.
Zach, really quick, for persons with substance use disorder, are they under that mental health umbrella also?
Yes.
Okay.
So a term that we'll run into in law enforcement often is like a drug-induced psychosis or other things that are derived from substance use. And so they would also fall under that umbrella. Really, it's the officer responding to an individual who is not in their normal, healthy frame of mind, and approaching the situation differently than they would someone who is mentally stable or healthy.
Thank you.
And so the basic goals of CIT are, again, to improve officer and consumer safety and to redirect the individuals with mental illness from the judicial system to the healthcare system. I think it's appropriate. I think it's a really important shift, especially as we recognize substance abuse a little bit differently than we have in the past. Again, trying to remove the stigma associated with it and helping those people who have these problems. especially when we consider that a large portion of these individuals are simply self-medicating to try to minimize or become unaware of the mental difficulties they're experiencing. So again, these sorts of incidents require a different approach than what may have been a traditional approach from law enforcement. And I'd say that the vast majority, if not all, of the law enforcement personnel in this area, I can't speak for other areas, we all have a pretty good awareness of those needs, although obviously our skill and proficiency could always improve in that regard. But some of the ongoing elements of CIT include multiple stakeholders coming together to form a sort of multidisciplinary task force designed to, again, help these individuals. So we have the law enforcement, advocacy, and mental health communities. And advocacy is a community that consists of multiple kinds of stakeholders, including the consumers' families and people like that. So law enforcement, advocacy, and mental health communities are working together to help these individuals. And examples of these agencies, these communities working together are, as listed here in the slide, CIT officers. Mental health court is a really good community resource. When someone who has broken the law, but it has been determined that it is derived from some sort of mental illness, then mental health court is a really good option for these people. And in order to get them rehabilitated, to get them services they wouldn't otherwise have received, those sorts of things. You also have nonprofits and NGOs. NGOs are non-government organizations. And one of a really good example of a public resource here locally is the Southwest Behavioral Health Center, which has got a ton of resources and can help people orient themselves in a direction they need to go to find help for their particular needs. CIT promotes and helps facilitate community ownership through involving all of the community stakeholders in the planning, implementation, and networking of CIT principles. So again, it's not just trying to remove the stigma of mental health, substance abuse, those things with officers, but also with the broader community and helping people understand that this is a much more nuanced problem than many of us maybe traditionally would have liked to admit. Some examples of this, so the policies and procedures specifically addressing CIT needs as they relate to a law enforcement agency, for example, is that most agencies, and I can speak for the law enforcement agencies here in this area and in Washington County, that at least a fifth, but more like a quarter of the force, and this includes correctional personnel, are CIT officers, which means that they've gone and conducted a 40-hour course. It's not just a familiarization with CIT principles, but an in-depth course that is designed to help these officers understand how to approach mental health crises and those consumers experiencing them. Dispatchers are trained quite extensively. So dispatchers will go through a fairly extensive dispatcher exclusive CIT training so they understand better how to ask questions during a crisis, how to de-escalate over the phone, how to interact with these people, and then simultaneously be able to inform law enforcement as they're arriving on scene, or the individual who made the call or the complainant. CIT officers will be dispatched to known or suspected crisis calls. In other words, one of the reasons why we have in this area and throughout Utah made it a policy to have at least a quarter or at least a fifth of the department CIT officer trained is so that they can be dispatched to these calls and assist other officers as they deal with the crisis currently playing out, and help in the de-escalation if possible, and try to keep everyone as safe as possible. The operational elements of CIT consist of the CIT officer, dispatch, and CIT coordinator. So that's the law enforcement role, or those are the law enforcement roles. And they are supposed to be working hand in hand with other community stakeholders as well. So the advocacy community as well as the mental health community. The CIT curriculum, again, 20 to 25% of officers will go and participate in this 40-hour training, but it's comprehensive, and it emphasizes mental health related topics and crisis resolution skills and de-escalation training. And again, all dispatchers are trained in how to interact with these individuals as well. And then a part of the operational element as well is to have a mental health receiving facility. And that includes behavioral medicine, which I think, I believe at all of the hospitals locally, at least with Intermountain, we have the resource of taking people and committing them to the hospital and the behavioral medicine unit. And I'll get into that in just a second. But what it takes for an officer to either help in committing someone to the behavioral medicine or involuntarily admitting someone to the behavioral medicine unit at these hospitals. But it's imperative that each community have a resource like this. So the sustaining elements of the CIT program are as listed on this slide here. And we have several of those resources that are available. The Southwest Behavioral Health Center is a resource in and of itself that will orient people to all of these things. And then through CIT, we want to make it a point to recognize those people who have applied the CIT principles and have helped to make the communities a safer place, both for all the stakeholders, including the consumer. So these are the intervention strategies or the de-escalation strategies that you can expect a CIT officer to employ if the time permits. And I have to stress that because an officer's primary objective is to ensure scene safety. And there's a hierarchy again for those things, and I'll get into that in just a second. But the 3 Ps: to prevent or de-escalate a crisis, provide officer safety, and produce a more permanent resolution. In other words, the officer needs to act in a way that will not cause further escalation, and something that could have been prevented. And then the more permanent resolutions. For example, if you're called for a suspicious circumstance, and that's talking specifically about an officer, the officer arrives and the subject believes that the FBI is watching over him. He has just shaved his head because he believed there were cameras in his hair. So what is a more permanent resolution? Documentation, finding history, getting in contact with family, trying to get them committed to behavioral medicine, whatever it is that we can do to keep this individual safe and not have to involve the criminal justice system in general. Obviously, that's a little bit different if a law has been broken, especially as it relates to crimes against a person. So assault, aggravated assault, and the host of other offenses that involve crimes against people. The officer needs to prioritize listening. And I know that there is this, at least a stigma associated with some officers in what we've seen, where they're pretty quick to make a determination without listening to the individual or trying to find more information regarding the circumstances. And again, it's all time permitting, but we seek to understand when we're listening, not to necessarily reply. And for the empathy piece, because initially it stated that officers need to be empathetic, and that's true, except we need to be careful that the degree and level of empathy is not so much that it impedes the quality of the investigation of the officer. In other words, it's the same thing with medical personnel, where you are expected to exercise compassion and compassionate care. But again, you need to provide the best, most ethical care that you would be able to provide for any person in that situation. And so we have to be careful as law enforcement officers when applying empathy and making sure that it doesn't impede our investigation into the incident. We need to find out where they are in their crisis. In other words, we need to gauge their level of responsiveness to instruction and to if they're able to articulate how they feel and where they're at, and what solutions could we work together to find for these people. Oftentimes when we're dealing with an individual experiencing a crisis derived from substance abuse, that can be very difficult because they're under the influence, or they can be under the influence. So it can be difficult in those situations, but it is nonetheless an effort of ours. Paraphrasing and reflective listening, summarizing a plan of action, not necessarily just regurgitating what they said, but trying to come up with a plan of action in collaboration with the consumer is a really good strategy for de-escalation as well. The ABC method, which is achieving contact, boiling down the essentials, and constructive action, right? Essentially deconstructing the problem and then working to resolve the problem together with the individual experiencing the crisis. And then another acronym, which again, you guys are all probably very familiar with the idea that our industry is acronym saturated, but DBEAT, which is distance, backup, empathy, awareness, and time. So this is something that's exclusively in regard to law enforcement, right? Can we maintain a safe distance? Can we expect backup? Can we exercise empathy? Are we in a situation that we can apply complete awareness? And do we have time? If you were to think of an incident where time really wouldn't be on our side, it'd be a barricaded subject, or a situation where we have a hostage or hostages, and time really is an important factor in what kind of tools we're able to employ to resolve the situation. In regard to the Good Samaritan law, at least as it relates to Utah, a person who renders emergency care at or near the scene of or during an emergency gratuitously and in good faith is not liable for any civil damages or penalties as a result of any act or omission by the person rendering the emergency care, unless the person is grossly negligent or caused the emergency. In other words, if you are acting with any degree of reasonableness, and as statute is concerned, reasonable means essentially, would an individual in your situation with your training and experience have acted in a similar way? And that would be considered the threshold of reasonableness. So rest assured that you are protected from liability, both from civil and criminal penalties, if you are acting in good faith and trying to do best you can with what you have at the time. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the Tarasov case. If everyone is familiar with the Tarasov case, I won't bother going into detail with this. Do we have anybody who's not familiar with the Tarasov versus Regents of University of California?
I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. So Tarasov essentially is where a patient went to go see a therapist, and the patient explained how they had an unhealthy obsession with Tarasov, a female that attended the same university, and the therapist informed the school. The therapist informed the law enforcement in the area, but nothing was done because no law was technically broken, even though the patient had expressed a desire to kill Tarasov. And unfortunately, Ms. Tarasov did end up being killed by the patient. And the therapist was found liable, if you can believe it, because everybody else involved in the case had qualified immunity. And I know that is just a real controversial thing, and it's an unfortunate situation. But it resulted in the idea of this precedent regarding safety versus confidentiality. And any of us who are dealing with patients who have expressed self-harm or especially harm to others, it's actually required in the state of Utah that it be reported to the proper authorities, and that attempts be made to protect the victim or the intended victim. So something that we do at the district, at the school district, is that typically we want to be able to share information regarding the perpetrator or the person who issued the threat. But FERPA actually has an exception related to safety and security. And when we're discussing patient confidentiality and sharing information, and this applies with HIPAA as well, the idea that if someone threatens harm to another individual, that you need to inform them that there is a threat against them. For us at the school district, we also inform the target of the threat, who is issuing the threat, and the nature of the threat. But that's it. That's as far as we go. We don't, with the individual who is the target, we don't divulge any education records, any mental health records, or anything like that. It's just, hey, you have an individual who's making these kinds of threats. It's this person. We've already notified the authorities. They know what's going on, and please stay safe. but there is a duty to inform as it relates to, and duty to protect as it relates to harm to others, especially, but self-harm as well. Now,
Zach, I have a question on that.
yeah,
Then you're informing the person that's being targeted. Is that on, do you feel like that's the responsibility, like on the healthcare worker or the teacher or whoever it is, or is that a law enforcement role?
so the individual who's providing the care and who witnesses the threat is responsible for doing their due diligence, which it would be in many instances, you're not going to know who the victim is, but you're going to have to go and make sure that you have notified the authorities and tried to gather as much information as you possibly can regarding the target so that that individual can be notified. So it's a lot like receiving. So in the state of Utah as well, there is a duty to report as it relates to child abuse in its myriad forms. And you, in order to make a referral to DCFS or to law enforcement, you need to make sure that you have as many details as possible in order to aid them in their investigation and protect those who need protection. The same idea would apply here. So you need to make sure you're doing your due diligence.
So from the law enforcement perspective, the information they're going to want about the person doing the threat or the perpetrator or whoever is the high risk individual, what information does law enforcement exactly need so we're not breaking HIPAA?
Yeah, so they're going to need any information that will help them with the investigation. In other words, they're going to need personally identifying information. So name, birth date, address, those sorts of things, so they can conduct an investigation into the individual. But then also, if there's anything that could aid the officer in, so say this individual is experiencing substance abuse and they're prone to experience mental health crises. You know, those sorts of details would be really important so that the officer knows going into the investigation or trying to find this individual what to expect and how they might approach the individual differently because of the information that was given. So any information that could help keep the officer and the consumer, in this case, the individual making the threat, safer, we would want to have that information.
So it would be information due to directly related to the incident
Yes.
and their behavior. So if they have a substance use disorder, any documentation we have with how they are under the influence or something like that would be important for you to know. But
Yes.
so we're just want to try to make sure where we draw that line of where the information, like,
Yeah, I would
we
say,
don't want to break the law.
yeah. And I understand that too. And this is kind of where it gets precarious as well, simply because we don't want necessarily there to be inadvertent we don't want to incriminate the individual, right? And necessarily in that situation, but you can state, hey, this individual does experience these sorts of episodes occasionally. Please be aware of these things. Does that make sense? So you don't necessarily need to go into the details regarding their substance abuse or anything like that necessarily in order to protect their privacy in that regard and to avoid the incrimination piece. But if it is related to their mental state and you as a clinician or other mental health provider know that they experience a certain kind of mental health problem, that would help the officer in approaching the situation appropriately. Does that make sense? Okay.
Is there anyone else has any other questions on this? I know the reporting's kind of a hard area of like what information you give and what you don't.
Okay. All right. So when do we want to involve law enforcement? This is a question that comes up pretty frequently. And I have to stress the fact that when we're dealing with mental health crises, uh, everyone is sort of at a loss in the moment of how we can help these individuals, especially if there are people in danger. And that's why we have this sort of prioritization of things and people we need to keep safe, right? During an incident. So the threshold of behavior meriting a law enforcement response is typically going to be harm to self or harm to others. That's when we start involving law enforcement. So it's not when necessarily an individual is raising their voice or talking to themselves or something of that nature. But if you perceive in them a danger to themselves or that they've expressed a desire to harm others, either implicitly or explicitly, then that's when we start getting law enforcement involved. The Another threshold would be if the individual has broken the law. So say you've trespassed an individual from the property and they have gained access to it again. You'd want to involve law enforcement, but this would be really important too, because oftentimes we can perceive an individual a mental health issue, and maybe that was the reason why we had them trespassed from the property in the first place, because they're unstable, they pose a threat to themselves or your clients or patients. Therefore, they've been trespassed from the property. Information with regard to previous incidents you've had with the individual would be absolutely vital in understanding not only the consumer or the patient, but also how the officer may be able to respond, because more than likely these individuals are going to be known by the law enforcement community, unless this is a first episode. So the priorities for a law enforcement officer as they arrive on scene are going to be first and foremost the hostage, then any other innocents that would be in close proximity to the individual, then police and public works. So public works would include clinicians, would include mental health workers, social workers, those sorts of people. And then lastly, the suspect. So if we can isolate the suspect from being around other people, that's the ideal situation, because then we can prioritize safety to be with that individual alone. Let's see. And then again, give as much information as is necessary for the officer to respond according to the needs of the person. History of incidents, triggers, that's really important. If you are familiar with the individual enough to be able to articulate what their triggers might be, that's really important, super beneficial, especially when we start talking about de-escalation and tools the officer can use to get the person calmed down and in a place where they can come to a resolution. And then mental health problems, right? And notice that criminal history is not a part of that list, right? It's not, hey, we want to dime out this guy who is obviously experiencing a crisis, but it's not the purpose of this. Let's try to keep him, the person experiencing the crisis, and everyone else safe. And I think it's really important that we have saved in our phones or have posted in our offices both the emergency and non-emergency lines for first responders, because not every call is an emergency, right? and maybe you just have a concern about the individual, and we don't need the cavalry showing up and and going to the nth degree to try to resolve a situation that wasn't an emergency in the first place, and escalating things. So
Would it be
obviously,
good to call if we're feeling like we're feeling like the escalation's getting a little bit high, and just to kind of alert and say, hey, we're dealing with something here right now. We're trying to de-escalate. These are the things we're trying. We're not being successful as we want. Just
mhm.
to kind of give you an alert that maybe there's an issue that needs to be responded to quickly.
Yeah. I think that that's entirely appropriate. If ever you feel unsafe, and I mean physically unsafe, I don't mean that you feel unsafe because they called you mean things or they were not being respectful. That's not what I mean. I mean, if you feel physically unsafe, or they've expressed that they mean to cause you or another person harm, then that's when we would use 911. Or you feel like the posturing, the tone, everything is escalating rather quickly, then yeah, don't hesitate to call 911. But if you feel like there is time and distance and all the things that keep people safe, and it's not necessarily an emergency, then yeah, I would let dispatch know via the non-emergency line.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this is where we get into civil commitments. And a civil commitment is a legal process through which an individual with symptoms of severe mental illness is court ordered into treatment in a hospital. It can be inpatient or outpatient, and it can be voluntary or involuntary. So obviously, you have a court ordered option there with a civil commitment, but then we also have an emergency application for involuntary commitment. And this is typically known throughout the law enforcement community as pink sheeting. So pink sheeting an individual is where a peace officer, essentially, because of the situation, because of uh, the behaviors and the oddities manifested by the individual experiencing the crisis, they elect to involuntarily commit this individual to uh, behavioral medicine at one of the hospitals. And they can do that. And typically, it's for only a 24-hour period. And this is really important for people who are either suicidal uh, or something of that nature. So if they're threatening other people, then most likely there's going to be involvement with the judicial system. But if it is self-harm, then the police officer does have an option to involuntarily commit an individual for a period of 24 hours to behavioral medicine. If there is a need to do so, then they can file for a 48-hour hold, and essentially a 24-hour extension of that initial commitment. And but that needs certification from a medical doctor to be able to do that sort of a thing. So that is an option and something that the officers can do if need be. And then these are some resources that I have provided for you guys. Just it's by no means an all-inclusive list or exhaustive, but each one of these resources represents essentially it's a repository of myriad resources that we can use as community stakeholders to help those in need of mental health treatment. And I don't know if you guys have access to those hyperlinks or not, but I would imagine that we can share these slides with you guys. Carissa, do you know?
Yes, we can provide the slides with the recording on the RHAU website.
Fantastic.
So
Okay. And that's essentially a brief, very brief overview of the law enforcement response or what you can expect. By no means was this an in-depth training of everything that we can do or all the tools at our disposal, but essentially a brief overview of what you can expect from law enforcement. Are there any questions out there regarding what has been presented today?
Zach, I just wanted to talk again about when we're calling and we're saying what de-escalation, because if we're trying to use some de-escalation techniques, does law enforcement interested in what we've already tried? Like having
Oh,
some documentation of things, even just in that incident or things we've tried in the past? Would that be information you would want to know?
absolutely. I think, well, every department's going to have their own standard operating procedure as it relates to crisis calls. And they will go through their own list of things to try if, again, time permits and the environment permits. But knowing what has been tried before would be very useful. Absolutely.
So documentation of like how long has the escalation been, you said you wanted to know triggers, but how long the escalation's been happening,
Mhm.
um, what's been tried so far, maybe what's worked up in the past or not, things like
Yeah,
that.
I would imagine it's going to be pretty difficult for you, especially, okay, so when people have gotten to the point where they're calling law enforcement, typically it's already reached a boiling point, right? So being able to articulate all of those details will be somewhat difficult. But if you can over the phone describe uh, what it is you're experiencing with this individual currently, what's been tried as much as is possible, yes, that would all be helpful. Uh, but understandably, it may be difficult depending on the situation.
It's been really interesting to learn just the level of things that you have been taught, because the past three sessions before this, a lot of the things that you guys are using for de-escalation are things that we have already discussed, like the active listening and recognizing triggers, the self-awareness, situational awareness, things like that. So it was really interesting to see how well they worked together, and that, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and
wouldn't
I
be
think
these things
that's
if they didn't
derived.
work.
Yeah, I think that's derived from the efforts made by the CIT program, and this has been going on for at least since I've been a police officer, which is going on 10 years. But the CIT program definitely precedes me. So it's been an area of emphasis, although there has been need for and there continues to be refinement of our processes and procedures. So uh, I can't stress enough how important it is that all of the community stakeholders are involved in planning and communicating and working together, collaborating to help these individuals out. It it needs to be a team effort. It can't just be the advocates or the mental health folks or law enforcement. It needs to be a load that's shared by everyone.
And you said every police officer receives this training. Do they
Yep.
ever recertify or redo more to like practice it or stay current with it?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there are continuing education requirements and hours that officers have to uh, undergo every year. So on an annual basis, we're receiving refresher training on CIT principles, de-escalation, arrest control, all of those sorts of things. And that's mandated by the state. But every single officer, whether that be correctional or a patrol officer, is goes through this training on at least an annual basis.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Is there anyone that has any comments or questions for Zach before we end the session? You guys really helpful. One of the things we've talked about is trying to provide safety plans and what to know to do. So it's really helpful to know exactly where and what to add law enforcement to our safety plans. So I really appreciate
Absolutely.
it. Thank you very much. And reminder, next week, we're going to be having USARA and then the last session will be the U of U talking about their processes and their safety plans and the resources they use for their crisis management. So anything else you want to say, Zach? Or
No, thank you for having me.
yeah, great. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone. Hope to see you next week. And we will have the slides and the recording up on the RHAU website within the next couple days. So thank you.